Now let's make our hello world component dynamic. What this component does is it accepts some string input from user and displays it after hello something. Um, let's see how that would work in Lightning. File, new, Lightning component. Let's call it hello X. And let us not specify any of these configuration parameters at this time. So let's just go ahead and submit. Because we did not check any of the checkboxes at the time of creating this component, notice that no interfaces were implemented for us automatically. So we have to type that in manually, like so. Let's implement force app hostable. Okay. Um, And now we need to accept some input and display it on the screen. Hello, something. For that, we will need an input element and an output element and perhaps a button that assigns value from input to output. Now, which input elements and output elements are supported by Lightning? The answer to this question is in Lightning Components library. There. There are a whole bunch of base Lightning components to pick from. There are accordions, there are breadcrumbs, buttons, button groups, input text, checkboxes, or something more complex like notification library for user notifications, overlay library for modals, etc. But it could get very overwhelming at this point. So let's just get back to our objective. I know that the one we want is called lightning input. So I could type that in here, lightning input. Click on it and you will see the different variants that it supports. The same Lightning component could be used to display a date, it could be used to display a date time, or it could be used as a file input, but the one that we are interested in is a text input. So click on that and let's pick the variant with a label and a placeholder in it, which is this. Okay, let's copy that and paste it. Okay. And then I'm also going to look up a button to go in our component. And let me pick the brand action, which is the third one, which is that. Okay. Copy that and paste it. And let me quickly rename our elements a little bit so they're more user friendly. Name is going to be um, user input. Okay, and the label is going to be, label is the text that goes on top of the input element. We could call it enter some text here, or let's do that. And then placeholder would be enter something like that. And for button, the variant is brand. Label is going to be, let's make it click me. The title that shows on mouse hover could be click me as well. Let me change that to uppercase. And on click, this is the method that happens, that is fired when you click on that button. But what method is this? Is it a Apex method? No, it is a JavaScript method that needs to be defined in your controller.js. Okay, and also notice the syntax. The way you invoke a method on button click is by specifying the braces and then the exclamation point and then c dot name of the method. Okay, the C dot convention is law of the land. When referencing methods present in controller.js, you must prefix C dot to the name of the method. Okay, we're yet to write this method, but that doesn't stop you from entering it here. Let's create that method now. Okay, let me first save this component the way it is, and let's go ahead and create that method. How? We're gonna click on that controller section, and notice that a piece of code is automatically written for you by default. This is where you specify the method name, and it takes certain parameters as inputs. Okay, by default you're presented with component, event, and helper. Component is a reference to the component in context. For instance, you could use it to get values from any elements or attributes defined in the markup. Event is a reference to the actual action that triggered this method. For instance, you can determine which button was pressed that triggered a call to this method. And helper is a reference to the JavaScript methods defined in the helper section. Okay, and regarding the naming convention, you could call them CMP like that, or EVT. Some of the documentation in Salesforce refers to them as CMP, EVT, or HLPR like that, or you could just call them a C, E, and H. But whenever I see shortcuts, it makes me cringe a little, so I'm gonna stick with their full names as was provided by default. Okay, but I almost always include all the three. So for the purposes of this tutorial, let's stick to including them at all times. Okay, going back, what is the purpose of this method? It needs to read the value in the text box and show it on the UI. So how do we get the value? But first, let me rename this method name to what we specified on the UI. It's called handle click. So let me copy that and paste it there. So our handle click method takes component, event, and helper as input parameters. And now we need to get the value of the text box and show it on the UI. How do we get the value? For that, let's assign something called as aura ID to the input element. Input element has another attribute called aura ID, and let's use the same text that we use for the name. We'll call it our user input. They could be different, but in this context I'm just choosing to keep them the same. Okay, so there is aura ID. Aura ID is very similar to how HTML elements have an ID, so we could identify them. And the way to get markup elements that have an aura ID defined is via something called component.find. So you already have component, and you could do component.find. What are we finding? The element called user input, which is the aura ID that exists on the markup. Okay, and let me assign it to a JavaScript variable where user entered value. And then this will give you the element that is present on the markup. And how do we get the value that user has actually entered is by doing dot get v dot value. Okay, the v dot syntax is how we refer to attributes, just like how we must specify a prefix c dot for method names. V dot is for attributes. It is law of the land and is required at all times when referring to an attribute. And what is value? This is the value attribute that exists on our input element, that the one that I just typed. Okay, what if you want to get the name instead? Instead of v dot value, you would specify v dot name here. Okay, if this were a checkbox, then to get the checked value, you will need to specify v dot checked. Okay, a full list of these attributes is included in the component library I showed you previously. But for now, let's just stick with v dot value. So, and a semicolon. So what are we doing here? We are getting the element called user input on the UI, and we are getting its value by specifying v dot value, and we are assigning that to a JavaScript variable called user entered value. Okay. Um, And now that we have the value captured in this variable, let us use our browser console to display whatever we captured in the logs. And that we do by saying console.log. Um, and let me specify something that stands out. Plus the value, the variable that contains the value at this point. Okay, let me do that and save it. Okay, now upon click, handle click is triggered, and it gets the value from the input text, and it assigns it to user entered value variable, and that value we're displaying it in the browser console, so we could verify that the actual value is being captured. Okay, and now let me quickly spin. Oh, I missed to save this component here. Let me save it, and let me create a application quickly, hellox app, so we could test this hellox component. Submit and include our hellox component in that application like so. Save it and preview. Okay, enter some text here. Let us enter something, text, and then click. And in the browser logs, you could go to the browser logs by going to that settings section, more tools and developer tools. And when you do that, there in the browser log, you'll see user entered value is lion. Okay, let me keep that logs open, and let me just do tiger. Okay, click on that and it prints tiger. Okay, but how do we display this value on the UI now? Okay, for that, let's go back to our component, the hello x component, and then let us create something called aura attribute in our component to store this value. Okay, you can think of aura attribute as just a variable declaration, but within markup, like how we say integer I or string s or list of accounts in Apex. Aura attribute is its equivalent in the variable in the markup. For that, let's do aura attribute name. It takes a name, and it also takes a type. Okay, and let's call it user input value, and the type this in this context is going to be is string, right? And let's save it. Okay, now we have an attribute ready to hold our value, and we already have our value waiting for us in this JavaScript variable. So all we need to do now is an assignment from here to the attribute. How do we do that? Like I mentioned before, elements defined in markup can be accessed via our component parameter. So you can set a value to an attribute that is present in the markup by specifying something called component.set. Okay, what are you setting? The attribute. And what is it called? It is called user input value. Let me copy that and paste it here. And remember that every attribute needs to be preceded with a v dot syntax. You should not forget that. So you're setting the v dot user input value attribute with what? With the value that is present in the JavaScript variable that we just created, like so. Save it. Now we just need to show it on the UI. The value that is captured in user input value needs to be displayed here, and because Lightning components support full HTML, all you need to do is show that value like so. Okay, in those flower brackets and exclamation point, just like somewhat similar to Visualforce, but make sure that you're preceding your attribute name with a v dot. Okay, and save it. Go back to our component, refresh it. Okay, let me type in elephant. Okay, there, elephant. All right. Okay, now let's go back to our component and let me just precede this with hello. That. Okay. Refresh our component, and it is now showing hello comma blank exclamation, because there is no default value that is specified for our user input value, and you could specify a default like so. Default value is going to be there. Okay, save it and go back to your component, your application, and refresh it. Okay, so when there's no value specified, it says hello there, but when you specify a value, it first prints the value because we have a console.log statement, and then it specifies the actual entered value right there. Okay.